I'm Julian Rogers from Digital Life Jamaica Observer, and we're here today to observe a very, very special observance. That is Data Protection Day, observed around the world. We here in Jamaica are really rolling out every effort to ensure that you understand the importance of data protection. Let's start first by welcoming our minister responsible for rolling out the NIDS project, Minister Floyd Green. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Julian. Happy to be here.
You got a big task on your hand. Back history, let's put that aside. Let's talk about what you're doing today and what you expect in the future.
Yeah, I think for any society to be able to identify their people in a verifiable way that can stand up to external scrutiny is critical. And it is something, as you've said, that we have looked at as a country for years, since the 1970s. You know, before I was born, we've been speaking about the need to be able to properly identify our people, but we've never really gotten it done. Where we are now, thankfully, is that we are much further along in that journey. We now have a National Identification and Registration Act, something that went through a consultative process. We had a joint select committee where various sectors across our country were able to share their views on what they want to see from a national identification system, how they want to see it operationalized. And now part of my role and responsibility is to drive the implementation of same. So I think we can finally say that we have passed a critical hurdle in terms of having wide-based agreement on what our national identification system should look like. But now it's getting that done, and that's my focus.
And those are the steps that you really have an opportunity to spell out here, because it's critical that the general public understand the work that is required, how much time is literally required to do this right.
Yeah, so a lot of the heavy lifting has been done, and I really want to commend the technical team at the Office of the Prime Minister and our various agencies like eGov, Tax Administration, Jamaica, and also Registrar General Department, who have put in a lot of work in ensuring that we have an act now that is palatable. Where we are now is getting our digitization across government agencies really fast track, because we want to ensure that our national identification system is useful, that when you get your ID cards, you can take them into various government and private sector entities, and you will be able to benefit from a more efficient and effective system. So next steps are really to roll out those cards, and I have been setting some real, I would say, stringent timelines, because again, I genuinely believe that this should have been done decades ago. So we're now working at completing our production facility to ensure that we can produce actual cards. We are far advanced in the development of the system that will provide that back-end support for the National Identification Database. And we are moving now in the legislative framework to move to our regulations. So we have already put out general regulations, and we are starting a consultative process. The technical team is finalizing the draft, and once those draft regulations are published, we will then move forward to put in a process where people will be able to directly comment on what they want to see done, and we will take that to Parliament. So we have set the time frame of this year to actually start the actual physical rollout of the National Identification System, and we'll get it done.
Minister, talk about the things that will benefit people. And I can think, for instance, of identity theft as one area, for instance. Talk about what this really means for our security.
Yeah, so I like to take it from two angles. And one is just the reality that as Jamaicans we face now in inefficient identification systems. And the fact that in transacting any business in Jamaica, you often need multiple identifiers, right? You need your passport and your voter's ID, or you need your voter's ID and a JP letter to say you are, and those pictures that they sign the back of. Very difficult, very inefficient, especially for younger people who do not have the network to get those JPs in line. So I think, one, having that database that is verifiable, that will have biometric information, that will actually be able to say you are who you say you are, will make a lot of those processes easier. So that is one. Now, we have not, in any of the database we have set up thus far, gone to this level to ensure that we prioritize data protection. It was one of the things that, again, we got a lot of comments on. And a lot of people indicated that one of the things they wanted to see from the government in bringing forward your national identification system, you need to have a strong, robust data protection framework. And as such, the Data Protection Act has been passed, and we do look forward to the regulations in relation to the Data Protection Act. And we have installed an information commissioner who will really be that data protector, right? So that is important. But outside of that, in the legislation, we have taken some steps that are the first of its kind in Jamaica. The information that is input into the National Identification System database will be encrypted on entry. So being able to get to that information will require special access. You will require a special key that you will use to decipher, and who will have that access will be vetted. And we have put in the law various penalties to ensure that those who have access, if they run afoul, that they will be held accountable. We've also put in place an inspectorate that will function as a commission of parliament that will ensure that the authority is doing what it has committed to in relation to data protection. So one, for the first time, we'll have a verifiable, secure database that can really say that you, Julian, are Julian. So it will be much harder to breach. And secondly, for the first time, we have really gone to pains to listen to our stakeholders and to put in the measures that we believe will make this the strongest data protection system that we have in our country.
Minister, you talk about access just now, and I can't help but ask you about the provision for people who would be considered off the grid, so to speak. Unfortunately, mentally disabled people, homeless people, etc. I mean, is this an exercise that will finally count everybody in this country?
Everybody. And again, I'm happy that through the Joint Select Committee, we're able to really take on the views of a wide cross-section of Jamaicans. We have been working with our association that treats with persons with special abilities and disabilities across the country, and we are working how that will be operationalized in the card. In fact, we do see this as a great opportunity to update that database of people who have disabilities, who have special abilities, who are now outside of the system and are not being captured. So we are working on a framework for that. In fact, very recently, I reviewed a proposal that we're working together with our association to see how we can have even members of the association at our enrollment sites to ensure that the data is captured and is transferred to them so that we can have a seamless pass-through. You know, what we want, Julian, and we're not there yet, but it's good to share the vision. We really want to reach to a stage where this national ID will capture all the critical information you need to transact whatever business you want to do. We want to reach that stage where if you have a driver's license, you won't need a different card. That information will be on our national identification system. And as such, when they ask for your driver's license, all you need to show is your national identification card because the information will be there. We're already moving in that regard with the TRN, so we can get rid of TRN card. And we want to move throughout our various services, our various certificates, our various licenses that can be captured in one database so that, again, you don't need that multiplicity that leads to inefficiency and also that leads to potential security breaches. So
you talk about one database. Are we talking here about one card only? The TRN bar is no longer it worked into the NIDS card?
So that's where we're going. That's where we're going. And I think, again, when you look at, as a regular Jamaican, especially a man from country, the trips into Kingston to have to go to multiple places where you give the same information, you fill up the same form with the same, and you worry to yourself, you say, so them can't just send the thing from this place to that place. Why do you have to go over this? It's frustrating, quite frankly. And when we look at what is happening around the world and how far the digital transformation has gone, how the conversations now are about the metaverse and how do you access that? And you look at where we are, with so many of our processes still being manually based, you realize you have a far way to go. For us, this verifiable database of identity, which has your biometric information, which can ensure that if you go to one place, the information can be transmitted to another place without you having to make that journey, will make life much easier. So that's the vision. The vision is to reach a stage where you have a requirement for only one source, one real identifier. We're not there yet. It will take us some time. But I think it's very good for Jamaicans to recognize that that is the overarching vision, which is to make our life easier. The system is now voluntary, so clearly we will go on the road to let people know why it's going to make their life easy. But also, we're not just doing that without taking into account the critical elements of protecting their data, especially in all that is happening in this world.
I must ask you though, because you made a point about the importance of the operation of government as a whole in its service to the community. What about the interagency, interministry communication that's required here?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm seeking to operationalize now is what we call an implementation task force, which will take the critical technology officers from across various ministries that will look at the foundation of needs. In other words, it will look at the various services that we need to digitize to ensure that when you have your identifier, you have your national identification card, you can unlock these services. So we're pulling together that implementation task force. There will be a subcommittee of that task force that will focus on communication. And I've already said to the team that I want that subcommittee to be broad-based. I want it not just to include technical people from the ministries, but to include the public, private sector, NGO groups, youth, women, our disabled community, so that we're communicating to everybody, so that we can have wide-based buy-in. But in terms of driving across ministries, we will have that technical team put in place. And I expect we are now in January. I expect that in February, we'll be able to unveil that implementation task force.
As you talk about the private sector, what role do you see for them?
Oh, very, very, very critical. You know, I believe some of the big challenges, we speak about government and the challenges and inefficiency with government. But if you ask people, what are some of the hardest tasks in Jamaica? I'm very sure opening a bank account would be ticked as one of those. And oftentimes the banks will tell you is, you know your client requirements, and same issue with identification and being able to verify independently. I think the private sector in general has a big role to play. I think our banks have a critical role to play, and especially the power of opening up society communities when they are now in the formal economy, in the formal space. So we're going to be engaging the private sector in a very real way. Thankfully, the PSOJ and the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce have been on board, and they have been big advocates for our identification system. Also, thankfully, and probably this is the only thing we can say thankfully about in relation to COVID-19, is that COVID-19 has forced both government and our private sector to digitize a lot of their services much quicker. So now a lot of things are gone online, and they need to have this verifiable database to make it more secure, make it more efficient. So we're going to be dependent on the private sector. I think the more of our services, public and private sector, that are utilized, are unlocked using our national ID, is the more useful it will be and the more people will sign on.
Finally, Minister, a general message to the populace, because this service is for them.
Yeah. So,
or should I say for all of us?
Yeah. So the message starts from there. This is our identification system. This is a realization that we need to ensure that we are transforming our society to truly take advantage of the digital space, that the government will not be cutting any corners in the implementation of the national identification system, that we will answer your questions, we will take on your concerns, and we will reform where we see that it is critical to ensure that the system has your trust and confidence, that we have already put in a number of the foundational pieces to ensure that your information is secure. And we will continue working on that together. So for me, the message is sign up. As soon as you get the opportunity, let us get the digital transformation of the Jamaican society done.
Thank you, Minister. And there you've got it then, the first stage of our focus on National Data Protection Day here in Jamaica. We'll come back with a panel to expand on some of the special issues involved, both from government and the private sector. If it's January 28th, 2022, then it's National Data Protection Day, not only in Jamaica, but around the world. And so you've heard earlier today in our session a discussion with the minister responsible for rolling out NIDS, the National Identification Program, Floyd Green. He referred to a number of people in that exercise, and one of them we'll introduce you to is the Information Commissioner. She's just one of the panel of 3 specialists that we've invited to look at this matter of data protection. The others are Chris Reckord, who is the CEO of tTech, a company that provides advice to every business up and down the country that wants to really protect their data. And also, we'd like to welcome Chuck Cameron, who of course is the head of a company called Design Privacy. The name alone suggests exactly what that company's role is in this matter of data protection. And it is with Chuck that I start by welcoming him to this panel. Chuck, let's lay it out for the general public now, why this matter of data protection is so important.
Thanks, Julian. So in 2019, our constitutional courts actually granted us, declared our right to informational privacy. And in so doing, our Chief Justice said that basically if anyone uses our data without our permission, they would be breaching our right to privacy. So we're starting from a position of a constitutional right. So not only is it a constitutional right, we have a piece of legislation that actually gives teeth to the right that was declared by our constitutional court. And that legislation sets out what those rights are. Why that is important, even more so today than, let's say, last year or 5 years ago, is the age in which we now live, the information age. We may not appreciate it, but at the end of the day, having the ability to determine and protect what is private to us goes to the heart of who we are as humans, that we get to define, preserve our dignity and what we hold dear to us. And I would not even start to speak about the extent to which government or private companies can exploit that private data and by extension exploit us without even being aware of it. So if we strive to be independent and autonomous beings, it's not only a question of being free from any physical shackle, but we must have the ability to determine our future, and the only way we can do so is if we can determine who and how our personal data is used.
Chuck, can you spell out for us now the key challenges in terms of making sure that we have a plan and a program that satisfies the destination we want to get to?
So the primary challenge is CEOs, boards of companies, individuals that operate in this space appreciating the fact that they are now fiduciaries and responsible for respecting and allowing their clients to enforce their rights. It is a monumental mind shift. Privacy has never been a natural part of our corporate culture, but it is no longer whether or not it was a part of our culture or not, because as I said, not only do we have that constitutional right, we now have that legislation that has put the teeth behind it. So the first thing that needs to happen, or the first hurdle we need to overcome, is that one, persons who are in the space in terms of the C-suite, in terms of the legal fraternity, they understand the awesomeness of the responsibility and the seriousness of the legislation that is there to support it. Once that hurdle is overcome, the next question is, okay, we now understand that all government agents must have a data protection officer. The next question is, where are we going to find trained, experienced data protection officers to actually implement the standards prescribed by the Data Protection Act? And so there is a lot of catching up to do. And so I personally, as Design Privacy, we were elated when December 1 came and the legislation was gazetted, and we now have the pleasure to be sitting beside our information commissioner. Because and I'm glad I'm not even sitting in her seat, because there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. So as soon as our C-suite or permanent secretaries or government, we understand that this needs to be done, I think the market will then start to rev up and start to put the support services in place, because even if we want to do it, where do we find the trained DPOs in circumstances where the legislation says that a DPO cannot and ought not have any sort of conflicting position? So this is not a job, for example, for a CIO or your head of IT or your in-house lawyer, because the essence of the legislation and the essence of data privacy and the importance that it places, that it must be independent. It must take, well, and when you see the fines that are attached to it, it must take priority over your other areas of operation, but there will be a period of time before we start to appreciate the significance. So in short, those are the big two hurdles that I think we have to overcome.
I'll come back to you in a while and get you to spell out some more of those challenges and take it right down to the street, so to speak. But you've given me a great cue for introducing the Information Commissioner, Celia Barclay, who is appearing for the first time in the media. And we want to give her, first of all, congratulations on your appointment. But let's find out exactly what stage are you at as your team now attempts to be this so-called independent entity in the matter of data protection for Jamaica.
First of all, let me thank you for having me, and thanks for the congratulations as well. I'm grateful to tTech and to Design Privacy for providing the opportunity for me to speak to the nation on the topic of data protection. In relation to the Office of the Information Commissioner, what I'd most like persons to understand is that the office has been established under the Data Protection Act as a regulatory office. And so its mandate is primarily to regulate the data protection regime insofar as monitoring the operations of data controllers go. But we go a lot farther than that. The office also has a mandate to inform and advise data subjects as to their rights. It will assist data controllers in terms of understanding their obligations and certainly cooperating with them in meeting those obligations. In addition, the office will advise the government of Jamaica on matters concerning data protection so that we can help to guide policies and procedures that are being put in place both for the public sector as well as for the private sector. And most importantly, we help to collaborate and cooperate with other international organizations and networks just to ensure that there is consistency between our regime and what obtains in the wider world. What we want is to ensure that in seeking to comply, persons are not only looking to the local legislation, but that our legislation also looks to what the world requires, because we understand that Jamaica is functioning in an international space. And so data protection is going to be critical to our ability to participate in that market. Trade and investment relies on persons having the trust and confidence in the system to know that any information that is required for business transactions will be protected. The office is newly established, and so where we're at right now is trying to put in place all the things that are required to make the regime work. So there is a 2-year transitional period that is provided in the legislation for data controllers to put their house in order, so to speak, get themselves ready for compliance. In that same 2 years, the office will also be getting up and running, become operationalized, put itself in a position to be able to properly implement the legislation and certainly to provide its regulatory functions. That involves several tasks. Primarily, we will be looking at the regulations that are required by the Act, working together with the ministry in order to ensure that those regulations are completed and disseminated. We will also be looking at even the very internal policies and procedures that we will need to have in place to ensure that our operations are both effective and efficient, and that in carrying out our functions, we're able to do it at the highest level. We will be looking at the systems that we need to introduce in order to allow us to carry out those functions. So as a regulator, we will necessarily be collecting a lot of information on the persons that we regulate. We have a duty to register data controllers. And so we will be taking information from them about them, not specific details about data subjects, but certainly as to the categories, the types of subjects, the types of information that they're gathering. Also in terms of information about the data processors that they might be utilizing and specifics as to the data protection officers that they will be appointed. So you will see where, notwithstanding that we have a regulatory role, we ourselves will be collecting a lot of data. And so in that regard, we have to make sure that the necessary systems are in place to hold that data, to protect that data, so that we maintain a standard that we are asking persons to live up to, but also to ensure that we are able to efficiently utilize that data. If it is that a member of the public, for example, wants to confirm whether a particular entity has been registered, we should be able to quickly answer that question and to let them know. Persons who are out there operating, processing personal data, who recognize themselves as data controllers under the Act and wish to register, we need to have a system that will quickly enable them to provide us with the necessary information and documentation and to complete that registration process as quickly as possible so that they can themselves be compliant with the legislation. And so these are things that we will be doing over the course of the next 2 years to ensure that when the point comes when the Act is fully implemented and we're asked to regulate these persons, including prosecuting persons that are in contravention, we are ready to go.
I have to ask you if you are going to be drawing on any existing databases to pull together your own database, or you're relying on the injection of fresh, from the start, data from everybody concerned.
These are considerations that we have to take in mind in choosing a system. We have not ruled out any particular option. Insofar as there are reliable databases that can provide the information that is needed, then we have not excluded the possibility of collaborating with the necessary organizations to utilize those systems. However, based on our role and the fact that we're in a regulatory position, of course, we're also open to the idea of a completely separate and new system and drawing on and developing new information as necessary.
Now, you talk about the, and so did Chuck, talk a lot more about the government's role in all of this, and then by extension the private sector. But I want to ask you about the reality of ordinary people's role in all of this. How do you see people complementing the activities that will make your job work?
Well, one of the first things I'd like to point out is that data protection is really a collective responsibility. And it is one that's only going to be fulfilled with a collaborative approach. So when I speak to a collective responsibility, what we're looking at is what is the role that each person has to play in protecting their data. Now, in that regard, everyone from the data subject right up to the regulator has a duty. For individuals, what we need is an appreciation of what personal data is, of what is necessary in terms of its protection, what their rights are under the Data Protection Act, and certainly a vigilance on their part to ensure that they're taking steps of their own initiative to protect that data. There are certain things that persons can do, and there's a lot of information in the media about steps that persons can take in terms of securing their information. But certainly, when you look to the legislation and how it operates, one of the things we would like to shine attention on is that each individual is now a data subject and they have the right to know certain things. So the minister spoke about all the forms, for example, that are required from different entities that you may do business with. Sometimes when you look in detail at some of the forms, you will see where persons require various information that you may not know why it is necessary. And so each subject needs to recognize that you have the right now to ask questions. Why do you need my address? Why do you need my TRN number? Why do you need, whether it is my medical history or my business history, my entire employment history, all the information that you are collecting that can specifically allow persons to identify me or to make a decision as to how to treat with me, you now have the right as a data subject to question, why is this information required? What is it going to be used for? Who are the persons that will have access to this information? Is this information staying with you or is it going to be passed to someone else? Who is processing it? How is it being processed? This is information to which every person is now entitled, has a right to request. And if it is that it is not, a response is not forthcoming, then they certainly have a right to report that to us so that we can then intervene and ensure that they get a response. Persons also have the right to determine whether or not their information should be processed. And so consent is a critical part of the data protection regime. And it is a part of our objective as an office to increase public awareness of those rights. In terms of the data controllers, the Act imposes certain obligations on them to protect the information that they collect. So no more can someone just seek out all or most of your personal information with very little explanation, not requiring your consent. It is the controller's responsibility under the Act to ensure that they are complying with the requirements of the legislation. The controller has to make sure that when they're processing information, they have any consent that is necessary. The controller has to make sure that each aspect of processing that information complies with certain standards. The controller has to make sure that the systems that they have in place have the necessary built-in security so that access to the information is limited, use of the information is limited, processing of the information is limited, and even the storage and maintenance of the information is limited. Because under the legislation, again, while you may be allowed to process with certain conditions met, at whatever point the processing is no longer necessary and the information is no longer required, you're also required to dispose of the information in keeping with certain standards. And all of this is built in to ensure the protection of the data subjects.
We've tended to inherit a lot of these forms that you referred to earlier that request information on this, that, and the other. I'm listening to you, and my thought runs to the possibility that we might have everybody changing up the forms because they should only be asking this much information of you rather than that expanded, list of questions that are put to people for, as you say, situations really may not merit the requirement for all that information.
Indeed, and that is the type of cultural change that we would like to bring about. We recognize that we live in the information age and in a digital age, and so ideally, in order for transactions to go through, in order for persons to interact in various spheres, a lot of information necessarily has to pass. However, what we want to encourage is a greater vigilance as to what passes where and to whom. And so we do encourage businesses, entities, authorities to do that type of introspection. Look back at what you require. Question again whether or not this is necessary. It may be that at a particular point when the form was introduced, the information was required. But based on how your systems and your processes have developed, you may no longer require that information. And you may now need to not only discard what you have, but also look at perhaps amending the form so that you no longer collect what you do not need. Now, these are processes that will take time. As I said, it will vary with each entity because different entities are conducting different businesses and require information for different purposes. And so each organization will have to look at itself, look at its role, what are the products and services that it offers, what are its processes that benefit external persons, as well as what is the involvement of even its staff in those processes, and make a decision as to how information really needs to be utilized and tailor their processes accordingly.
All right, I'll follow up quickly with that one and talk about in the age of hesitancy. People listening may say, boy, I really don't think that I really want to go down this road, and become very paranoid about the whole process of sharing information with institutions and entities, etc. What role do you see your authority literally helping people in those circumstances to better understand the requirements?
Well, in terms of the reluctance that you mentioned on proceeding down this path, I believe the primary role of the Office of the Information Commissioner is to provide the reassurance that the public needs, both as to the need to take the journey, as well as to how it can be safely taken. Now, in relation to the first, what I would point out is there are some things that cannot be avoided. While we know that there are persons that may avoid having, for example, a digital footprint and who choose to be more reserved in their interactions, the fact is we live in not just a nation, but a global society. There is no stopping the move towards interaction, integration, collaboration among countries and across regions. And so the sharing of information will happen naturally. So there's no point fighting the process. What we want to do is to ease the process for everybody. And one of the things we will be focusing on, particularly when we start our public education initiative and our campaigns, is letting persons know that this is not a change that we expect persons to make overnight. It may not be a change that is easy for everyone. There are certain steps that will be required, particularly of the data controllers, and persons like tTech and design privacy can assist in expounding on that. But one of the things we would like individuals to know is that, as I mentioned earlier, it is a collaborative approach. So insofar as any consultations and discussions are needed with stakeholders, our office is there to provide the avenues for that. Our office is there to manage the interest and the expectations of all the persons involved. And so what we look at is how we can reach out to the data subjects, make ourselves aware of what their concerns are, and certainly take steps to address those concerns when we're talking to the data controllers on their behalf. What we can do is to facilitate communication between data subjects and data controllers, involve the data processors themselves, so that everybody can be on the same page in terms of the importance of what is happening, as well as how it impacts on them, and where necessary, what steps they can take to mitigate those impacts, but most importantly, to ensure that the law that has been put in place and the regulations which are to come will be complied with in the interest of everyone.
Let me tell you, people, look out for Celia Barclay, the Information Commissioner, and her team, who are determined to ensure that your data is protected. Let me bring Chris Record in here, who's been literally a voice crying in the environment of cybersecurity and much more as head of tTech. And nearly 30 years or so he's been in this business, really, with a gospel really about security. Now, I'm sure that you really welcome this development regarding the information protections that are coming from the government agency and the partnership by the private sector and the individual. What challenges do you see at this stage in getting this all done? Celia talks about 2 years in which to roll out everything on that side. You've been waiting for some time for this, right?
That's correct, Julian. Thank you very much for the opportunity. One of the big things is the hesitancy. The other big things that happens to us when we're talking to people about data protection, IT security, is there just feels that it doesn't have to be them. Nobody's targeting them. They don't understand why this is necessary. I'm not processing that much information. So having a law in the country that speaks to protecting people's private data, and then now, if you are in fact processing people's private data, you now need to put in technical measures. Under Standard 7 of the Act speaks about organization and technical measures to process it properly. That's where we've been out there, early warning signals, early nudging, motivating folks to let folks get your house in order, because there's now a law in the land that says here are some of the steps that you must take to protect private data that you are processing, which includes, of course, the information technology systems, because that's what, there's still a few people using books. There's still a few folks who the information is taken, that book is then placed whether under the table in front of them. So that's a process that still needs to be fixed. So whether it's analog or it's digital, we deal in a digital space. You have to put in systems to protect the private data of folks that you are, that you're processing them for. So yes, we've been out there waving the flag around awareness, just generally cybersecurity awareness. Because the instant that you now are running these systems in there and folks realize how valuable this information is, then all of a sudden somebody wants to get it because somebody finds it valuable, which is why we decided to partner with Design Privacy, who's handling the data protection side of things, who's been talking about all the various organizational measures to support them with the technical measures that we can come and do the analysis of what do you have in place, here's what you're supposed to have in place. So at a high level, that's how I'll start.
Chris, I think you're the right person to put this question to. How can you give people the assurance that their daily activities are safe?
Well, first and foremost is to tie what they're doing in their organization, the type of processes, the type of applications that they are running, as that connects to the use or processing of people's private data. Once we understand that, and as the Commission explained a while ago, some of the standards around having the data subject the ability to ask what data is
and when you say data subjects, Chris, you mean me and you, ordinary people.
The people,
right?
The people's data that's being processed.
Okay.
So once an organization is processing people's data, the data subject's data, the organization should be able to tell the data subject what this is for, how long it's they need it for, and all of that. Then, at some point in time, if the data subject so requires, they need to explain to them what systems are in place, what technologies are in place to protect it. And if you can explain to so for example, a scenario with several customers, data access. Who has access to this system here? Is it everyone that works in the company, or only the folks in accounts, or only the folks in accounts and logistics? Who has information around? Because I gave a purchase order. On this purchase order is my name, maybe my phone number, my email address, maybe my TRN. I've given that to you now. You now have that. What's that being entered into? Is it entered into a secure database, or is it on a piece of paper hanging around the office? Where is it? So to give assurance, that assurance needs to come from the control. I mean, from the organizations that are going to this customer and say, I need this data in order to give you back this product or service. And they need to explain to them, here's what's happening with your data. I mean, I've been a customer, and over the last year, because of interaction with Design Privacy, and because I've had to sit down and read the actual act several times, I've realized that I'm now asking questions. I'm now in companies asking them, all right, why exactly you need all this information for? Guess what? Right now, most can't answer. Most of the persons who you deal with at the front level, they can't answer that question. So to give that assurance that you're asking for, right now, I don't think from a technological provider, a technical service provider, an information technology security service provider, that information that is inside of the IT department that the CEO of the company may understand is not reaching the front desk or the help desk or that order taker for the service that I want from the organization. Somehow they need to figure out, and that probably needs to be an organizational measure, that needs to come around to explain to people why we need this line, why we need this line, why we need this line, to ensure that the data subject feels that, you know what, I'm now assured that they have the proper systems in place and the proper technological solutions in place to protect this data, and it's not going to leave.
I want to ask Chuck to come in here, because what would you say is the impact of the work from home on this matter of trying to protect your data?
In the absence of the Data Protection Act, we may have lost, or businesses may have lost the opportunity or the imperative to protect personal data that is being processed at home. So before COVID, from the IT security standpoint, your defensive perimeter was your workplace, and you'd have built out all the necessary measures to protect anything coming in and everything coming out. However, remember I started at the beginning with this whole concept of data protection and data privacy being a constitutional right. So it really centers around the person, the individual. So no longer is it business centric or technology centric. It is now individual. It centers around, yes, the term data subject is a new term, but that is what the legislation speaks about. Yes, it is talking about you and I, or you and me. Somebody with him was correct. But so how do we protect it now? We actually have to move away from the old constructs. And it does mean that people in the IT security business have to redefine how they set out to protect that information. And you do have, there are approaches where the biggest thing, and that's one reason I was happy Minister Green was here, the biggest issue or the first step in protecting personal data and access and securing those perimeters is first identifying and protecting and authorizing that individual. Who is the person trying to access personal data? Is that person who they present themselves to be? Who are they? So that's the first thing. We also need to move beyond that. And there was a decision coming out of Belgium, well, not a decision. Parliament has now decided that wireless communication makers must build in cybersecurity features in the hardware, because that's the next step. Once you identify or qualify the individual to access data, you now need to identify and qualify the instrument or the technology or the device they're going to be using to access the data. So while COVID and the work from home that flowed from COVID has changed the parameters, the law was always centered around the individual. And there are new models that the space is responding to that protects that scenario. So we're no longer trying to protect spaces. No, we have a duty to protect individuals.
And as you speak of individuals, let's get down to some basic elements here. Passwords.
Well, depending on what your school of thought is, passwords are no longer safe as they used to be. That's the reality. We really move into a scenario where we're talking, and I go back to authenticating the individual. So how systems are usually penetrated, and I should really be handing this over to Chris, So I get carried away, but design privacy. What we did, we chose to focus on helping companies implement the organizational measures. And to answer those specific questions, we partnered with a tTech to speak to how do you treat with passwords and those sort of security measures.
Chris, your cue.
So in terms of passwords and other methods of authentication, there are hundreds of systems out there globally that offer people many ways to do it, depending on their budget, depending on the complexity of the organization. But I also want to tie back the passwords, going back a little bit to your work from home question. And with respect to work from home, Chuck answered it correctly with respect to the fact that the perimeter was now all of a sudden widened. So it's not in a building anymore, not directly connected to your physical network anymore, where the systems that many organizations could have monitored that easily. All of a sudden now, you now have this internet that you have to traverse. And yes, while people may have virtual private network software and ways to try to ring fence in all of their users, all of a sudden it just got more complicated, right? And the fact of the matter is that not only were you working from home, your children were also schooling from home, right? And so some situations out there we have seen and we have heard in the cybersecurity space that we operate in our industry, stories around parents who share digital devices with their children, and the horror stories because that child is now downloading some game or something on the device where malicious software got into to then enter into the organization through that. So all of a sudden, that IT manager responsible for security, their job just got a lot tougher. So that's where a fair amount of the work now has to be going, which is where organizations like myself and others out here in Jamaica are helping people to test, to ensure that we look to make sure that the right technical measures are in place to protect against things like that. And technologies out there to do that. In terms of the passwords, you may have heard the term two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. That's one of the best bets to get, and that multi-factor can be whether it's facial recognition, fingerprint, also connected to a password and special passwords, and using email addresses only for banking and for nothing else. And so if all of a sudden you got it on your Gmail or Hotmail account that you use for all your games, hey, your bank has been compromised, you know it's a scam, you know it's somebody's trying to get you. So passwords, Chuck may have mentioned, there are people out there, some schools that thought that passwords are dead. And yes, you're right, just basic passwords are no longer enough. You have to have more authentication methods. And again, it depends on the complexity of the organization.
Celia Barclay, how do you see your organization dealing with the matter of the public education regarding the data protection, using the tools available to them, being deeply embedded in understanding and carrying out these functions day after day?
Well, our primary responsibility is to both inform and advise. So in terms of our public education, the intention is to have an actual planned initiative that will focus on taking material and information relating to data protection to persons individually, as groups, in various collectives. So the initiative will be set up to approach persons, for example, in associations, so that we can target a wide audience. In terms of the groupings, just about every and any group is a potential recipient of our public education campaign. And that is because the act is so impactful. It definitely has a meaning and implications for every single person. And so it is necessary to get the information out there to persons as subjects, to get it out there to persons as controllers, to get it out there to persons as processors. So wherever you fall within the data protection regime, we intend to focus our attention on you, both in terms of bringing information, as well as I said before, garnering what the different concerns may be and assisting as far as possible in addressing those concerns. But one of our primary considerations and a message that we need to get out to the public is that data protection does not ensure data safety. You asked the question earlier, how do we make sure our information is safe? Well, the role of the office is to set up the regime and to police it. But neither this office nor any private sector entity can guarantee the safety of your information. And so the duty is for each individual to look at how they can secure their information, take the necessary steps, whether by themselves or through securing the services of the necessary persons. There are various individuals in the regime that can help. However, at the end of the day, there is always a threat and there's always a risk that something will get through that security system. And so the primary role of the office as well, and something that is built into the Act, is to have a remedy. At the end of the day, persons need to know if it is that my rights have been contravened, if I have become a victim, then what are the possibilities? Is there some compensation that I can get? But even more important than compensation is, what is the remedial action that can prevent this happening to someone else? And so built into the legislation are penalties, of course, for non-compliance, to encourage data controllers to take the necessary steps to protect data subjects' information, but even more so, directives, of course, that the office can give for action that they can take to prevent a recurrence of any incident that has taken place. We also go as far as to provide guidance where necessary on an industry level. That's one of the provisions that's built into the legislation. So we can look at each sector and what the particular risks are within those sectors and work with the stakeholders to say, how can we counter those risks? What is it that you need to do? What are the best practices, not just locally, but internationally, that will help to guide and protect against breaches of data protection rights?
I can't help but ask you though, if you're really in breach, really done something bad in terms of not being compliant, what's the worst penalty?
Well, the penalties in the Act are structured based on the nature of the breach and how it is prosecuted. So what you have are, less serious offenses that nonetheless need to be penalized. And for those, what you may have is a fine. You have fines that are as low as, say, $1 million, but it also goes up based on the severity of the offense. And you have other fines that, because they are so egregious, because of the implications to the data subject, those penalties can also include imprisonment for a number of years. Which penalty applies will depend on several factors. So we will look at what the nature of the breach is. We will look at the level of the impact in terms of not just the scope, the number of persons, but also the implications for those persons and the wide effect that it might have had. And we also look at which of the obligations have actually been breached and how onerous a burden that was. We will look at what preventative steps the person might have taken. Is it that this controller was particularly negligent and did not have the necessary systems in place? Or are you looking at someone that exercised all due diligence in attempting to comply, but this happened anyway? And so depending on those and other factors, the penalty that is issued out will vary.
Chuck, I just want to quickly ask you in the final moments to address one thing that came up. Do you see this whole process dealing with scammers?
So there are several angles in which we could address that very open-ended issue you have put on the table. So again, it goes back to the whole question of verifying identity. So the thought process is, through my eyes, is that something like NIDS on a local level will significantly protect our citizens from getting scammed locally, because there will be ways to identify scammers. Because a scam is walking up to somebody's gate purporting to be someone from a government agency or some telcos, but with that national ID, one should be able to address it. The data protection aspect of it is those organizations or government entities that are maintaining that database that you verify your identity against. To what extent are those protected against exfiltration or infiltration? Because while scamming is really on a person-to-person level, once we now collect all of that data and store it in one central space, that is where the greater risk is. So for me, the whole data protection regime, the NIDS regime will minimize that, but while minimizing it, if we are not mindful as to how we protect that source of truth, that source of truth can be the biggest risk. And that is where we need to really appreciate and at a bare minimum follow the standards that have been prescribed by the law at a bare minimum.
Chris, finally, I want to ask you about this timetable. It seems to me like we got 2 years in which to roll this all out. What has to happen as far as you're concerned? Priority.
So from a technical standpoint, from the technical measure standpoint, we want potential businesses who have to register to understand, what do I have? What do I actually have in place? My IT guy tells me that such and such and such and such. Let's do some verification. So some sort of a impact assessment on the business needs to be done from an organizational measure, from also a technical measure. Just to tie back to the question a while ago around the scamming. Awareness training, the human being is the biggest potential barrier. So if you inform the users, the team members, the business, all the folks within the organization, what to look for, what not to look for, that is so. User awareness is also on that timeline. In terms of priorities, to understand, I said, what do I have in place and what do I need to have in place? I think that is the first thing. And then after that is just to go with now the organizational part of things in terms of that privacy assessment. Because when we talk to folks about protecting their customers' data, especially personal data, the first reaction is a lot of people, they don't process any. But when you do the assessment, all of a sudden you point to them so many places that they're processing this data that they didn't realize. So that is one of the first things that have to happen. People need to just use the time. And we've been talking about it, Chuck and myself, been on a fair amount of panels, just saying, hey guys, don't let the 2 years run out. And all of a sudden you're caught with, pants down.
Which brings me to the question of cost, Chuck.
Good. I'm going to go back to the other scamming
Yes.
question, and I'm going to put it in an international context.
Please.
So the international word for scamming is social engineering.
Yes.
So social
People.
engineering.
Right.
So that is what they call scamming, and that is how entities attack networks and attack companies through employees by pretending to be other individuals. So scamming is not peculiar to Jamaica. It's international.
We didn't invent it.
No. And one may not even be the best at it. And then the timelines. What I want to, so because we are on the ground, focusing on data protection and compliance, and we have experience in implementing it, one of the first things the legislation requires us to do is to register. When people hear about registering, one would think it's something like going to the company's office and filling out some forms, either by yourself or a lawyer, and you file it, and it may bounce one time, and then you go back and you can get it done. Worst case scenario, 1 month, worst case scenario. But they now have a 24-hour service that you can even do it in 24 hours. From a practical experience point of view, when we speak about registration, it is nothing like that. This data protection regime, you have to start from scratch. You need a minimum of, from this is just our experience from a practitioner's point of view, you need at least 12 months to gather all the data that is necessary to register. Because part of registration means not only saying who your data controller is, who your data processor is, and who your data protection officer is. You have to identify all the personal data you are processing. You have to identify everyone you are sharing with it. And then you have to tell the Information Commissioner what is your data protection plan, or how you intend to protect this data. Before you can do that, you have to assess all the risk with processing the data. So it is a very involved process just to get to the start line. And what we like to ensure our clients understand is that after you register, you have not started to comply with the substance of the Data Protection Act. You are now at the beginning line, and you can now start about thinking about implementing all the requirements. In terms of cost, it's what we like to focus on. Well, let's say it, you will be incurring costs because it will require you to, without a doubt, change your modus operandi. So even if that cost is associated with change and effort, there will be cost associated. But because we are in the information age, our experience has been that what the data protection really tells data controllers or help them to do, is how do you operate efficiently in the digital space? Because all they're saying, these are the basic things you should do if you're going to be processing personal data. And it's not only limited to digital, but it assists us to and gives us a roadmap at things you can do to maximize the information you have, to save server space, to save storage space, to save processing power. Because we heard about the Information Commissioner speaking about minimizing the amount of data you have. So if it is you understand you only need 10% of the data that you have in terms of the 100% you are collecting, that impacts on processing, that impacts on server space. So if done properly and aggressively, in the long run, there is more money to be saved than that you may have to spend. But there will be initial upfront costs that it will be difficult to avoid.
I'm going to ask the Commissioner to respond to the question of costs. If the people come up and say to you, this thing is costing us money, what do you say to them?
It will ultimately save you money because liability is expensive. And what the Act does is to impose not just a responsibility for you to comply, but a liability in terms of, as I mentioned, the penalties for failure to comply. One of the things that we want to do is to dispel the notion that compliance will be easy or that it's just a matter, as Chuck mentioned, of naming yourself as a controller, naming who your processor is, pointing on someone and saying this person is my data protection officer. We've spoken a lot in the discussion about the controller and the data subject, but a key focus for the public needs to be on the concept of data processing. The Act actually spells out what data processing is. And if you look on the definition in the legislation, it covers every single thing that you could possibly do with information from the moment it is collected to the moment that it is disposed of. So it includes how you get it. It includes how you store it. It includes how you use it. It includes how you or your employees access it. It includes how you provide access to it from other persons, whether those persons are your clients, your customers, or third parties that you are using to manipulate the information. It includes anything that you do to the information. If you alter that information, if you generate it in any way, if you manipulate the data, every modification is a part of data processing. How you retrieve it from storage, how you pass it from one officer to the next within your organization. All of this is data processing. And we have not gone yet to when you pass it to a third party who is then going to generate reports for you or who is then going to feed your marketing information. And so if you look at it in that way, you recognize that the responsibility is a big one. And certainly, it is something that we will be helping persons in terms of fulfilling, but it's something that persons need to appreciate that, one, they will need to help themselves, but two, because of limited resources, we can't help every single person in every possible way. And so the role of data protection officers and data privacy professionals are going to be critical to the implementation of the system and to the effectiveness of the regime. And hence why we're having this, and we'll have future public education campaign to bring that home to persons. And so everybody can get on board on what the plan is, what their role is to play in the plan, and have the system working as it should.
Chris, on cost, but I want you to direct the message to the SMEs.
small, medium enterprises. So as Chuck mentioned, there's going to be cost. Generally, when we get these questions, it starts with it depends. So it's going to be dependent on the complexity of the customer's organization. Let's say one such customer who called, or one such business who called asking about costs, and they don't use any private data. But all of a sudden, there was a realization that they have a staff of like 12 people, and they have all of their data for all the staff members. So, say you're processing data. To assess a small organization like that, the fees are going to be relatively small. The measures that organization need to put in will be a little less complicated. They still need to ensure that that data that they're using for their 12 staff members are protected, and it may just mean having a secure database, whether that database is locally in country or in the cloud, and they can identify where that cloud system is either in the US or in Europe or in South America somewhere. They may be able to get that information, and in doing that, the cost to sign up for a system or a service like that is minimal. I mean, minimal at best. I mean, we're literally talking a few $100 per year, depending on the size of the organization. A medium-sized business, because small business in Jamaica goes anywhere from 5 up to, let's say, 50 users. A medium-sized organization, over 50 users, depending on the industry that they're in, if they're in financial services, then it gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, the costs will go up accordingly. So they may now need to know whether they're going to hire a specific IT security person, or they're going to outsource an organization like ours or other organizations out there that provide IT outsourcing services to help manage and monitor and maintain the systems that keep and process that data. That may now get up into the a few thousands per month of United States dollars, depending on the complexity. So the costs include initial assessment. Some people do some version of assessments for free. Mostly do it for a fee because you have to go in there, you have to do some heavy lifting and do some work. So, the message to small and medium enterprises, put something in the budget. Put something in the budget to start off, because you have to comply, and it's going to cost something to get all of this working.
What I'd like to do at this stage is ask the panel to share with this audience one bit of information that they think will help them start the process of protecting their own data.
So I'm going to address this answer to government agencies, permanent secretaries, CEOs, and directors. I want them to ask themselves this first question. 1, have we acknowledged that we now have a legislation that requires you to protect personal data? That's the first thing. The second question is, have we assigned anyone or given anybody ownership about finding out about what it is and putting a plan to comply? That is the first thing I'm going to invite persons at that level to do. At the me and you level, I want persons to start asking the question, why are you processing what data are you processing for me, and why you need that data from me? Those are the first two at the top, and who it's all about, the citizen.
Chris?
So as I was listening to Chuck, I thought to myself, and I'll do it, every committee and board and organization that I advise or assist, I ask them, are you aware of what this Data Protection Act 2020 is all about? And if you're not aware, you need to become aware right now. And I literally just hand them over to Chuck and say, Chuck, would you please go in and do a presentation? He'll come and talk to them for free, right? To just come and give them an overview as to what this law is and what it means for them. So I start with awareness, and I'm saying, everybody, get aware, don't delay. Do it now.
And the last word I give to the Information Commissioner, because she has the job of being independent in the midst of all of this and driving this process for national good. Celia.
What I would say to everyone is the Data Protection Act is here. It is here not just to stay, but it is here for our collective benefit. And wherever there is collective responsibility, there's a need for a collaborative approach. But that needs to start from an informed position. So know, first of all, what data it is that the Act protects, and then ask yourself or find out from someone, what are the rights that this Act has given you? What, if any, are the obligations it has imposed on you? And how best can you fulfill that? The office is here to assist in informing individuals and advising them. And there are, as I mentioned before, various professionals within the sector that can assist you, both in terms of what you need to know, as well as what steps you need to take. So the time to act is now. Don't wait until 2 years down the road when we have fully implemented, we're in full regulatory mode, and we're now looking at who is not doing what they're supposed to do and who has breached somebody's rights so critically that this is now worthy of prosecution. The deterrents are built into the Act, but what we want to focus on is promotion of respect for data privacy rights.
All is left for me to do right now is thank our panel, who I describe as the data protectors. If we had to do a poster, we put up the three faces on that poster with a slogan that says, get involved, get protected. I'm Julian Rogers for Digital Life Jamaica Observer, encouraging you to protect your data. It's very important. It's everybody's role in this. All the very best.